Hello, everyone.
Evening, Phil.
Hello, Jord, and hello, Timon.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us today for this Psalms video. So, Jord, where do we fit this particular session in our series that we've been looking at so far?
Well, it's quite exciting because we're going to just take a dip out of, we've just began book 2 in the Psalter, and we're going to have one of our thematic ones. You can see that if we have any more, Phil, I think I'm going to have to space them out a little bit more on the screen. But we're going to be looking at Psalms across the whole Bible and within the Psalms. So a little bit different to Richard's, where he sort of looked at the order of Psalms after each other. We're going to think about how Tim was going to share some thoughts about how they're quoted outside of the Psalms and inside of the Psalms. And we sort of, I remember a few sessions at the very beginning, we had those little icons, didn't we, Phil, where we saw that, especially in Psalm. I remember in Psalm 2, we looked at that, where it was quoted in Acts and different parts. So really excited to hear Timon's thoughts on this. So Timon, where are you going to begin with this vast topic, with all the different New Testament, Old Testament quotes that you could go to?
Well, yeah, there's hundreds of them, I think.
Sounds like we've got a big session with Jord.
Could be a long one.
Yes, there's there's many direct citations, not even counting the number of allusions or references or links that you could connect across the Bible. So to narrow it down, we'll be starting with direct duplicates of Psalms, where a number of verses have been lifted out of a psalm, or maybe even the whole psalm, and where those specific ones are. And then we may touch on a bit about the value of citations in terms of layering other passages or contexts, or an extra level of understanding. Significance, that's right. Yeah.
Great. Well, do you want to share some of your slides then, and we can see what you've prepared for this topic? It's quite interesting, Jord. I wondered if, just while Timon's doing that, if any of our people who've been watching this series have thought of any big theme topics across the Psalms that they'd like us to consider in future videos. By all means, comment on the video here or get in touch directly. I know there's been a few alluded to by some of our other speakers in the past. I was intrigued with one of the ones recently about the theme of praise and where that might occur. So, but by all means, if you've got any ideas or topics you'd like us to consider in the context of the Psalms, do let us know. We can try and weave them into a future program, God willing. Great. Okay. So, Timon, tell us a bit more about the Psalms across the Bible.
Yeah, well, in terms of Psalms that are duplicated elsewhere outside of the collection of Psalms, I've only found 2 places where that occurs. There may be more, but I've only found 2, and that's 1 Chronicles 16, 2 Samuel 22. But before we look at those, I think the value of looking at the contexts outside of the actual psalm itself, like the Psalms stand alone. Each one doesn't necessarily need a story behind it for you to be able to understand what it's about. You can still get value from that, but it is also, I find, quite helpful to, if there's a story that you can link to it. These are written by real people who've had faced challenging times, which is like what your series is about. How can Psalms help us in challenging times? Well, these are the thoughts of people that faced challenging things, and there was this inspiration or prompt from those contexts of the real people that wrote these psalms to actually then produce these amazing sets of poetry that were put to music that were used in temple worship. So that's, I think, the value of looking at psalms across the Bible is you're adding extra things, contexts to really boost the impact of the psalm itself. And this is Psalm 3, and I just really picked that at random. It's a short one, it fits on the screen, and it shows what I called a preface, that little bit of text before the psalm starts, where you do have this kind of linking of context. It says, not all of them give details like when he fled from Absalom, his son, like it does there at the start, the Psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom, his son. But that's giving you, I guess, a link to the context of this one. And then that postscript at the end where it's delivered to the choir master with a bit of an instruction as to musically what should happen. So you see, I'm not going to go through this one in detail, but there's a lot of expressions of trust, crying to God, call for salvation, and David's just the context of as David's just left the city of Jerusalem, and he's been caused to have to flee from Absalom, his son, who's taking over the kingship. So David's just been robbed of pretty much everything he has, potentially with no guarantee to ever come back, and so he's got his whole life's been thrown into chaos, basically. And we get an insight into what he's thinking at the time. And so when our life is thrown into chaos, maybe in that sense, maybe not quite as dramatic, but we can match sort of our experience with the story in David and then turn to the Psalms, where if there's one that's matching, you just get that extra connection with it. So.
Right. Yeah, the titles of those prefaces are really fascinating, aren't they, Jord? We have a lot more detail on that if you're interested in one of the earlier videos, wasn't it, Jord? Was that Kevin that covered those?
Yeah, Kevin did a two-part series on those titles or prefaces, and it was really useful to see. He talked about how they were also part of the text, and yeah, really useful one to look back at if you've got the time to go back and look at that. Absolutely.
So that's really helpful, Timon. You've linked already some of the Psalms here, like this one, to a specific example in David's life. You mentioned there is some evidence then in the narratives of the story of David that he is using or quoting some of these Psalms then? Or even expressing them? You mentioned.
I didn't really find any references to the Psalms in the story of David in the way that the New Testament cites Psalms. I guess it's just those two places where the Psalms are actually put into the story where they appear. And yeah, other than that, there's not really allusions to text in the Psalms found in the story of David.
So what are those two examples about then? You're going to come to that, or going to go into that now?
Yeah, that's up next. I think this one in First Chronicles 16, it starts in, I think, verse 8. You have where the song starts to be sung, but it's this particular story is where David's bringing the ark to Jerusalem from the house of Obed-Edom. So you probably remember the story of Uzzah when there's that disaster. They're carrying the ark, and it was in a cart, and the cart tipped a bit. Uzzah put out his hand to stabilize the ark, and he was struck dead, and they took the ark and just placed it in the nearest house of Obed-Edom, and it was sitting there for a while, and David is kind of regrouping, and he's thinking, well, that was a disaster. How can we do this properly? And so there's this whole parade and ceremony, and along with that was a whole lot of music, and David was dancing before the ark, and he composed these songs, and it seems like David was, as far as I know, the first to instate worship to God associated with the tabernacle in this way, where he would write this poetry, write it down, deliver it to the musicians to perform. And so the record in First Chronicles 16, you've got this procession of the ark, and then this celebration of joy, which is a whole lot of psalms. Actually, it's not just one psalm. It's, from what I could see, it's 3 psalms in First Chronicles 16, verse 8 through to 36.
What song? Sorry, song allusion? Sorry, I was just going to. Oh, here we go. I was just going to ask which psalms are they alluding to, Timon?
Yeah, so it's Psalm 105, Psalm 96, and Psalm 106. And I don't know why those ones are chosen, or anything insightful about the compilation of that in that chapter. I'd like to know if there's anything significant about that, but it's also, I thought, curious that there were bits and pieces of the psalm chosen and not the full length. Now, there could be a number of reasons for that. It might be that those full versions of the psalms have been condensed in the Chronicles record because maybe the worship went on. It probably went on for a long time. So perhaps that song in First Chronicles 16 had a lot of content, and when someone came along and compiled the psalms, they took extracts of that, but then also the First Chronicles 16 record may have been a condensed version, or all those, any combination of that.
Sorry, Timon, I was just going to say, just an interesting thought I had when you were saying about why perhaps it's those 3 psalms. I was just quickly looking. I believe they're all in book 4 of the Psalter. And going back to our sort of slide, if you have time to go back to the first video that we did in this series, I sort of presented a view that book 4 was that aspect of the psalmist recentering their life towards God. And I thought it was fascinating that you just referenced the story of Uzzah and how David used the word regrouping. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing, that here, if it's 1 Chronicles 16 that it's citing, it's interesting that, again, it's this sort of recentering, regrouping phase after quite a devastating, difficult, challenging moment within the life of David, and also in the big picture of the whole book of Psalms. So I didn't know that was just, and it's interesting as well because the last Psalm 106 is the last Psalm within book 4 before we get on to book 5, which is that real praiseworthy sort of book within the Psalter. So there's perhaps just a little.
The other thing I was thinking here, just before we go on, Timon, for those watching, you mentioned they were given to a musician called Asaph. I think, Jord, we'll come across some more psalms dedicated to Asaph, won't we, in book 3, when God willing we get to book 3. Just interesting seeing how it all ties together.
Yeah, absolutely. And book 3 is there's some quite challenging psalms in that book, as we saw.
Right, that's fascinating, Timon. They got those 3 different ones then alluded to then in this record.
Yeah, I haven't done a word for word Hebrew comparison of those 2 records, well, the Psalms and First Chronicles, but it does seem like a duplication pretty much. And yeah, that gives some context to those of celebration and worship.
So you were saying, Timon, there was a second echo or allusion or citation to the Psalms as well in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's 2 Samuel 22. It contains a copy of Psalm 18. And that's, I think, the whole of Psalm 18 is in 2 Samuel 22, except for the first verse, which is verse 1, I love you, O Lord, my strength. But from verse 2 onwards is copied. And yeah, the context of 2 Samuel 22 is David's just been fighting his enemies for a while, and he's got victory and he's got peace, and so he writes this song in praise and thankfulness for that victory over his enemies and from Saul. So yeah, a lot of challenging times. I think the ones with Saul was probably upset him or got to him more than fighting against various Philistines and other enemies. It was the ones, the betrayal by friends or struggling to know what to do with Saul, who was God's anointed, but also really was unstable and wanted to really hurt him, was hunting him. So yeah, this Psalm 18 is really interesting to read through with that context in mind as well, as an expression of praise and gratefulness.
I was just going to say as well, if people wanted a bit more detail on that psalm, we did a video session with Josh, didn't we, Phil, that went into quite a lot of detail in that struggle that David had. And I think we went to 2 Samuel 22, didn't we, in that session to look at some of the context for it. So that's really helpful to see that again.
Great. So you mentioned they were the 2 main ones that you saw, a big slab of text from the Psalms is in the record in the Old Testament, in the narrative. Where else have you seen Psalms then being used?
In the Psalms? That may not count, and I don't know why there are copies of Psalms in the Psalms, but these are the 2 ones I've found, where Psalm 14 is in Psalm 53 and Psalm 40 is in Psalm 70. And I don't know, it might be for a musical reason, maybe a chorus or a commonly known piece of poetry that sort of comes to mind in 2 different contexts, or I'm not even sure about whether the authors are the same in those but yeah, we have a duplication of those there as well.
Are they, sorry, Timon, just, are they, you know how you said in the one we've just been to in Samuel, it was a big slab of text from the Psalm. Is that similar with these examples here, that verse 1 to 6 is a big slab, as we've called it, from Psalm 14? Or
Yeah, there are more variations in these than with the other ones. So I think like verse 6 of Psalm 14 is a little bit different to what's in Psalm 53. Like the number of verses aren't exactly the same, but yeah, there's just a lot of similarities.
Yeah,
like word for word copies of verses.
yeah, that's helpful. It's just helpful to differentiate that between when we just come across a phrase. I know in the last session we did, Phil, we got that phrase of why art thou cast down, O my soul? It's just interesting to make those comparisons, that's more perhaps of just a phrase or reference, whereas this seems to be quoting a lot more of a psalm.
Otherwise, we'd come up with loads. Your one you did on steadfast love, his mercy endures forever. Yeah, that came up a significant amount of times. Seems to be one of David's favourite little phrases he uses a lot in the Psalms. But this is a lot more, isn't it, than just that sort of phrase. Right, yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe if you're watching, you want to look at those Psalms in a bit more detail and recognise some other patterns. I think when we get to the second version, like the second time these occurs, maybe we can look back at when we've done the videos on the previous ones, Jordan. We can see what's similar or different between those Psalms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So what else is there then? You've mentioned Psalms in the specific record of David's life being quoted, Psalms within Psalms itself. What else have you found, Timon?
So outside of direct duplications, there's a lot of other connections, and you may have seen these diagrams before where people have plotted links within the Bible. There's just common threads all through. Various chapters linking books and events, and the New Testament has a lot of citations of the Psalms that are, direct copies of verses, and then a lot of allusions to Psalms as well. I think the most cited verse is Psalm 110, verse 1. It's probably Psalm 110 as a whole, maybe 20 citations. I'm not completely sure on that, but there's a lot, and particularly in the book of Hebrews, probably the most. And so these Psalms definitely, a lot of Psalms have parallels with the story of Jesus. So one of these, which you've may have looked at before, is and I referenced earlier actually when David fled from Absalom. And so we've got the story in 2 Samuel of David leaving Jerusalem. And then that table there sort of shows a parallel with the story of Jesus leaving the Last Supper and then being betrayed by a close friend, as David was betrayed with Ahithophel. So there seems to be a parallel of stories there. But what further sort of confirms the links between the two is where Psalms are directly cited in relation to Judas. There's John 13 and Acts 1. John 13, where There's a specific reference to saying that, so it might be fulfilled, where it says,
Yeah, we left in no
This-
doubt there, is that it's very clear that this is a fulfillment of the psalmist's writing.
yeah, and when they're replacing Judas with another disciple in Acts 1 verse 20, after Jesus ascended, they reference a few psalms as well, as a reason to do that.
Mm.
And I think those are also David's, they're at least his commentary on being betrayed, and I'm thinking it's likely, very likely, that it is Ahithophel, given the closeness that they had as his advisor, and also the seriousness of the betrayal and how that impacted David. So I think it's quite likely that you can link those psalms to being Ahithophel, and definitely expressing betrayal, and then linked to Judas in Acts 1 verse 20. So yeah, there's probably many other examples like that where psalms are cited, but this one has a really interesting overlay of the narratives as well as the spiritual thoughts of the people involved, in the way that they were affected, the way David was affected, and the way Jesus was affected.
Mm.
Interesting, because we sort of alluded to this the other week, didn't we, Phil, with Psalm 41 with Chris, in this aspect of Ahithophel and Judas Iscariot, and we actually looked at a few of these references that Timon's put up for us in that really helpful table.
Yeah, so it really made me reflect, just using this as a really good example, Timon, of how the Lord Jesus really found it powerful looking at, thinking about the Psalms as he was experiencing many of these things himself, and would have gained support and comfort, and also, I guess, must be quite powerful to know that what's being said is going to happen is actually coming to pass in your life as you're experiencing challenging circumstances. Fascinating.
Mm.
That's a great example, Timon. Was there any other thoughts that you had around this this topic?
No, that's it.
Great. So what really stood out for you then, Timon, in terms of application then as a summary for us in challenging times, and from this topic that you've been looking at?
Yeah, I think just the benefit of turning to a psalm in a challenging time, because they are written by people that face challenging things, and that's, I think, unique. The unique thing to me for psalms is that insight into the mental health of someone, their inspirations, their feelings, the way they relate to God, their attitude to God, describing their relationship to God. And yeah, it's really, I think, helpful to be able to read someone's thoughts in that way, as opposed to a lot of other different types of presentations of spiritual things in the Bible. Like you have stories, you have proverbs, you have prophecies, you have life of Jesus, you have letters, but this uniqueness of the psalm in showing someone's prayers and thoughts in great length and detail is just a really great thing to be able to turn to, and to be able to understand the lives of the people by linking Psalms to stories and to New Testament passages as well, really gives extra power to that.
Fantastic. So any final thoughts then, Jord?
No, just to say thank you, Timon, for that. That was a really helpful exploration of looking at the citations, and not just, that can be quite a dry subject, can't it? Just looking at where passages occur, but actually, like you just really nicely concluded, how that can have real meaning for our lives, and how it can really encourage us through these challenging times, and how the Psalms is a really unique way of doing that. So thank you for just sort of bringing that out for us.
So to all of you who are watching, thanks again for joining us with these videos, and may God bless you as you consider the Psalms in these challenging times along with us. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bless.